talk,
identity,
and access
management.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Pretty good. I think we're going to keep this one a little bit shorter because I know you actually had a conversation with Paul Voloshin from Centrify about some of the concepts used to manage IAM for server access, and want to make sure we give enough time for that. I found it pretty informative as you were recording it earlier this week, and a really good intro to some of the terms and methods that are used for managing access to those types of resources. Before we get to that conversation, is there anything that you want to touch on?
No, I think it's kind of a 101 for managing server access. So people who are kind of hard grizzled vets in that space, it's going to be a little basic. But for a lot of people who are IAM practitioners who didn't come up through that angle of IT, I think it could be informative, right? We kept it kind of basic. We talked about kind of some of the basics of how you manage server access when it's one server, and then what are the challenges for managing it as you do it in an enterprise and you have hundreds or even thousands of servers. So that's kind of the perspective we talked about it from. And as you pointed out, Paul was a very informative guest and somebody we'd like to have back in the future if that's possible.
Yep, he's former Identropy and now a Centrify, so good people, as we like to say. I particularly enjoyed your pseudo definition, and I'll tease it at that, but I thought that was very informative. I think even, grizzled vets, you may find kind of nuggets here and there, but definitely, probably more geared for, folks who maybe aren't as familiar with it, but I liked it. I thought it was really informative and a good refresher in some cases for some of the concepts that are out there. And hopefully it will give people a good kind of platform to stand on as they start to think more about privileged access management from a IAM perspective.
Well, what I was thinking, Jeff, was if we had a listenership of, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, I'm sure we'd have our haters and we'd have a Twitter page full of people correcting every little nuance of everything we said that was, not correct or could be misconstrued. But we're not quite there yet, so we have a little bit of leeway.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just the nature of the game. There's always going to be haters about something or something to correct. And hey, you know what? If it's something that needs to be corrected, let us know. We're happy to take that. For me personally, and I'm sure for Jim as well, here's what we think or here's what we're doing. And if there's something that we can improve on or need to be corrected, that's fine. Great. Tell us, educate us. So we're always happy to take that feedback and get smarter. It's okay to get smarter over time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think we'll kind of leave it as a brief intro for this week. We'll get to that conversation here right after the kind of little bump that we'll do. And hope you enjoy that conversation between Jim and Paul. And we'll talk with you guys in the next one.
The show will be right back. Don't forget, you can email us at questions@identityatthecenter.com.
Hey everyone, Jim McDonald here today with the Identity at the Center podcast. I've got a special guest with me, Paul Voloshin. He's currently a Centrify employee and Identropy alumni and part-time troublemaker. Paul lives in Austin, Texas, and he's a security geek by day, adventure seeker on the weekend, but he's currently stuck at home and being productive during the current pandemic that we're all dealing with. No matter where you're listening to this podcast, I'm sure it's affecting your life. So, Paul, first question, did I get the pronunciation of your last name right?
Actually, kind of close. So the official Romanian pronunciation is Paul Voloshin. I think you had a little bit of an SH in there. So you actually got pretty good. Thank you. And I'm very happy to be able to sit down and chat with you. I have good memories of Identropy, and I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah. We sorely miss you. But so I figured we start this off with something fun. And you helped me out with that introduction, adventure seeker on the weekend. So give us an example of
maybe your most impressive weekend adventure?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. So I do like a lot of adventures, especially traveling. So I really like to go to many different places. So I've been probably to most major cities in the U.S. and at least a couple dozen countries. Um, Honestly, the best adventures that I enjoy are being by the ocean on the coast, especially the Pacific coast. I've driven that coast at least 12 times in the last 10 or so years and absolutely enjoyed it. So actually, I was just there about a few weeks ago, right before California got shut down, and stayed at an Airbnb, drove from LA to San Francisco. Um, it's very peaceful. I absolutely enjoy it, and I consider that one of my favorite personal adventures.
I love that. I've done that myself, and Big Sur, California is it's a true gem of the United States. I'd say anyone who's listening, if you get an opportunity to do that, stop in Big Sur, spelled SUR, and there's like some cool bed and breakfast there. It's like what rural, wooded California on the coast. I mean, it's one of the coolest places I've ever been. What do you think?
No, it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, and the tips I would give you is if you can get a convertible, if you have a convertible, take it, or rent one if you can. It's absolutely beautiful. And two, I mean, there's a lot of cliffs and a lot of tight turns there, so you want to be careful not to go at night, or if you do, to be careful. The first time I went with a friend of mine, he was going kind of fast, and we almost had a very scary end result. But it's absolutely gorgeous. It's breathtaking. I love Big Sur and the entire coast. I agree with you. 100%.
Awesome. So, Paul, one thing we always like to get into: how did you get into IAM? And what's been your career journey since then?
Great question. So, like I think with most people in IAM, it's people kind of fell into it. For me, I got very lucky, and I was able to start what now is basically 20 years ago at Microsoft. And I worked there for basically my first 10 years of my career, and worked as a program manager on the security team, and built kind of a foundation on the lower level security features like the authentication modules and making changes to the operating system. And so that I was able to use to basically get a job at SailPoint, which of course is is one of the big players in identity management when I moved to Austin, Texas. And for the last, almost 10 years, been working with SailPoint, and then the last couple of years with access management. And so that's how I got into. That's a short story of how I got into identity access management.
Yeah. Like you said, most people fall into it. I fell into it. I was a network engineer at a big company, and wound up working my way into the project management side of the house, and then ended up, kind of in a business project where we wanted to pull our portals together. It was our dealer portal. We wanted to have one dealer portal that crossed multiple brand channels, and to realize that, well, we had all these different identity silos, and we had to pull it together. And lo and behold, there was an industry called identity and access management. And so I became an expert all of a sudden. I shouldn't say I became an expert all of a sudden. I was forced into becoming an expert. So, but it's paid dividends. I love this industry. Yeah, that's one of the reasons we have the podcast, is to help people, who are new in this, getting into the industry. Maybe they're on their first project, but do you have any advice that you'd give to folks like that, or any kind of words of wisdom?
Well, identity access management is great because it never gets boring, and it pulls in so many different types of technologies, and you have an opportunity to learn so much, right? So you can do access governance, you can do policy things, you can do automation, you can do DevOps, you can do security. So for someone that gets bored easily on technology, which is myself included, I think a lot of techies are like this, right? We're in this because we're intellectual, and we're trying to maximize our use of our brain. Identity access management is an opportunity to do that. Once you know networking really, really well, there's not that much more you can really learn about TCP/IP and Wireshark once you know cryptography really, really well. There's not that much more, that you can do, in my opinion. So identity access management brings all the technologies that you could possibly work with into play. And I think that's the opportunity for people. And that's what's made it most fun for me, is because I'm always learning and I'm always love to learn. And so for anybody that's looking into it or starting into it, it can be overwhelming, but believe me, the ride is fun and it never gets boring.
I love it. I love it. So, Paul, one of the things that we try to do with the podcast is, focus on one topic during the discussion. So we picked as our big focus, what we wanted to talk about today was securing server access as a discipline within IAM. So I think what you're getting at is there's so many different things within IAM to explore. But so one of the sub-disciplines is securing server access. And so, I know that you've been in this space for a while. Maybe you can share kind of some of your perspective on managing server access.
Sure. So to me, securing server access within IAM really means figuring out who has or should actually have access to what resource based on a specific business need. So for example, if you have contractor and full-time employees that have different functions, if you have a contract web administrator, they may only need to be able to have access to a small set of servers to perform a particular function like start and stop the web service. And they may not need to have access to other production servers or servers that are just designated for full-time employees. So it's figuring out, who needs access to what and what resource. Now, customers, try to do the best of this on their own, and this works fine when you have a few PCs, but it becomes a lot harder when you get into the hundreds or thousands of and it becomes harder when you're managing Unix and Windows systems, when you're managing two different types of IT people, when you're managing different organizations, or you're doing merging of companies. So it becomes increasingly more difficult as the company grows and as the environment grows. And that's where identity access management comes into play, right? So there's different IAM solutions and PAM solutions to assist in that type of a larger problem.
Yeah, and so much of what you just said there I could relate to. The idea that somebody would have their entitlements or their abilities on a server kind of restricted down to stop and start a web server. Well, as somebody who is kind of that level 3 support, I built the web servers, and I would write instruction sets for the overnight support folks to maybe they're level 2, or they realize, okay, there's a problem with the web server, and I wanted to have them be able to do X and Y troubleshooting steps, to not have full access to the server and be able to ratchet it down to just being able to do certain tasks. And the more you're able to do that, the you just don't want to leave wide open access to folks if they don't need it. That's kind of the whole idea around least privileged access.
And that, I mean, and if you just have a small number of servers, you're doing that, and you have just a few employees, that can be done. Windows and Unix has a pretty good, management for users on that scale. Maybe less than 50. But once you're getting into more and more users, it becomes increasingly more complex, and it becomes increasingly more expensive and risky to rely on, traditional management. Because if you make a mistake, that can be very costly for the organization as far as being breached or having an attack. And so IAM solutions, in my view, come to really mitigate the security risk that an organization has.
Yeah, Paul, I'd like to add to that. One of my perspectives is that IAM is, especially when you have a larger organization, it becomes something that requires kind of checks and balances and oversight. And a lot of times that oversight is by people who aren't the super techies. And so by having an IAM system and requiring, folks to work within the IAM system to manage security and to manage their privileged access, it creates a paper trail. And then non-technical, the audit type folks can look at that paper trail. And what you really need to do is design it so that there are not backdoors. Because especially when you're talking about this type of access, backdoors are the last thing you want, because really the people who are the ones who are managing servers are the ones who would have the backdoors. So, this is truly an oversight function, or maybe I'm not even saying that right, but it's the term that's coming to mind is kind of the fox guarding the hen house. When you have a situation where the server administrators can set all the security for themselves, is that really the level of security that you want, or do you need to have it so that there are checks and balances? And I think especially for larger organizations, you need to have the checks and balances in place.
No, I totally agree. And maybe to restate that a little bit differently is, provides a mechanism for the business to trust but verify. If I'm the Linux admin and you're, upper management, you look at me and you say, are you applying good security principles? Yes, I am. Do you have access? You providing access only to the people that need access? Yes, I do. Trust me, I'm doing that right. Well, maybe I am, or maybe I'm not. Maybe I made an intentional error, or maybe it's just an accidental mistake or an oversight. So if you have good IAM solution, it provides you a easy window for you to validate essentially the policies that you think or expect or should be into play. And SailPoint and other tools provide that mechanism for identity access government, and Centrify provides it on the privileged access management side.
Yeah, I think one of the points you're bringing up is came to mind for me as well. Like when I explain to people what governance is all about, it's sure you can have the greatest automation for managing and provisioning access, and you could do all that centrally. But if an administrator goes through the back door or directly into the application and creates an account or elevates privilege for an account, if you don't have that loop coming back to say this, to compare what should be with what actually is, then you're missing something, right? And so that's what governance is all about, is verifying that what should be also is the same as what actually is. And when you have a difference between the two, that it's being acted on and that there's visibility to it.
Yep.
So Paul, I had an idea. So I'd like to play a little game, because I feel like, within the IAM space, there's people who come in from a technical perspective. There's people who come in from a program or project management perspective. And I feel like obviously folks who specialize or maybe came from the server space, this is going to be a little basic for them. But for the other folks, I think this is an opportunity to have some learning about some of the basics, some of the terms they may have been hearing throughout their career, but really don't know what they are. And so I'd like to play a little game, which is that I'm going to state a term that has to do with securing server access, and you describe what it means kind of within the context of identity and access management. So I'll start off with one that, I remember hearing this and not knowing what it was: sudo or sudo.
Sure. So sudo is, basically running a program within the context of another user. Usually that's root, but it doesn't have to be. It's akin to, it's somewhat loosely similar to run as or the elevating, Windows UAC prompt on the Windows side. And you can configure who can do what in what context in the sudo file and other configuration file. Unix admins are very familiar with it. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, when you've got a couple systems or under 10, under 50, 50 is probably high. You can manage it okay, but once you've got many hundreds of servers, managing that sudo file across hundreds of servers can become difficult. If you make a mistake and you put the wrong sudo files, you can give the wrong people access, and restrict the right people from having access. So kind of a long-winded answer, but sudo is basically being able to run an application, a Unix application in the context of another user.
Yeah, and so I'll add my little perspective as well, which is one of the things that I think really helps is sudo is kind of an acronym, super user do. And so the idea would be I can log in with my Jim McDonald account, which has very low power, but then I can use sudo to say sudo, and I want to use a backup account to run a backup job, or I can so now kind of do elevated privileges by running commands within the context of that of other accounts, because Jim McDonald doesn't have the ability to do those things, but I can use some of those ideas. And then the management challenge becomes each one of those servers has that file that you reference. So how do you manage when you have hundreds or even thousands of Linux servers that you have to manage a file full of accounts? And so that's kind of the tradition, because to me the art and science of doing IAM when it comes to servers is that servers were designed that you don't need an IAM system. They weren't designed with the idea that, okay, there's going to be thousands of servers and you're going to have some kind of central administration tool. You can run a Linux server by itself and have all the identity and access management capabilities within that server. It's then when you get a large number of them that you have a management challenge, and then you have to extract some of the IAM from those servers and put it into a central mechanism for managing the identity, managing the authentication, logging, etc. So that's kind of just my 2 cents on that. The other one,
I agree. That.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Please.
I said, ahead. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's my experience and my view as well. Excellent.
So the next one, I'm going to just say both of them because I think, it could get confusing otherwise. So the term PAM, I'm kind of an IAM nerd. So I think of privileged access management. But within the context of servers, there's PAMs, pluggable access modules. This is these are, I'm going to state these terms to you. So PAMs, pluggable access modules. Why don't you have at it?
Sure. So pluggable access or pluggable authentication modules is, Unix's implementation of different authentication mechanisms or providers. It's loosely similar to what I'm more familiar with, which is security support provider or SSPI in Windows. And really what PAM allows you to do is to have multiple different authentication modules on the Linux system, and then you can configure them to perform different functions. So you can have a Kerberos authentication module, you can have an MTLM authentication module, you can have different authentication modules for the different authentication mechanisms that exist, and then configure them to perform different functions. So to be more specific, or to talk about the power of PAM really is, for example, you can have one module that can do account authentication, and then you have another module that'll do password validation, and then you have another module that might do session management or making sure that a particular password meets specific policy requirements. And that's all configurable in the pam.d directory, depending on which PAM module you have. Vendors that provide privileged access management will plug in and provide their own PAM module to take over those functions.
Right, because I think when I think of a PAM module, going back to my original example, like a server can exist by itself. It has its own kind of default PAM modules, which would look at files. I mean, that's one thing about Unix and Linux is that's so cool, is like everything kind of goes back to files. But if you wanted to, instead of using a file full of usernames and passwords, you wanted to use an LDAP directory or some other, or an Active Directory or something, or the example you used was NTLM, which is what is that? NT Logman. It's like a protocol,
No,
right?
Land Manager.
Land
Yeah,
Manager. That's
NT
right.
Land Manager. It's a precursor to Kerberos. I mean, it's not considered very secure anymore, but it's what existed prior to Kerberos.
Right. And so if you want to, and so that would give you the ability to what, like authenticate to an NT4 domain or something, probably not anything you'd want to do, but the idea is like if you wanted to externalize a function of authentication or authorization, you could do that with these PAM modules, right?
Yeah, NTLM is probably a bad example of what you should implement these days. So I probably shouldn't have used it. Yeah, I mean, with what you want to be using is more recent and more secure authentication modules, either Kerberos, or if you have a privilege access management solution, a vendor solution, a vendor privilege access management solution. So that's where the other PAM comes into play. Because now you can have better configuration via the application level about who has access to what, and then you can tie that to AD bridging, for example, to use Active Directory as your single source of truth for users rather than having hundreds of users across hundreds of different servers. So, PAM, the other side of PAM, privilege access management, will take advantage of pluggable authentication modules and build their own authentication module to take a priority over the built-in systems one.
Yeah, we've been focusing a lot on, Linux management. On the Windows side, privilege access management can be used for, service account management. I think that's one of the ultimate uses for privilege access management. In my book, it's just an area where I see so many clients, even big companies, where they don't have a good handle over service accounts. What's your perspective there?
Yeah, so service accounts becomes a little bit easier to manage with privilege access management because you can lock down service accounts, you can vault them potentially, and then you can limit who has access to them by a particular Active Directory user, or a particular Active Directory group, or a particular role. And you don't necessarily have to have everything run under a service account. But if you have a good privilege access management solution and it's configured properly, you can get better control of service accounts.
The next one that I wanted to throw out to you, LDAP. People who don't know what LDAP is, what is your primer for them to get a basic understanding?
Sure. So LDAP, or lightweight directory access protocol is been around, I think, for a few decades now. There's various versions of it, 3.0, 4.0. Microsoft's implementation of LDAP is Active Directory. There's also other LDAP implementations like OpenLDAP. I think there was like a Novell LDAP. But the one LDAP that everyone's familiar with is Active Directory. And Active Directory provides you a format and a way to store information about objects, especially identity objects. There can be other objects as well, like computer objects, and specify security groups, and then specify containers and OUs for where those users or those security groups are maintained. So it's active. When people say LDAP, most people are thinking Microsoft Active Directory, but there can be other LDAP implementations as well.
Right, and there's a combination of, this is one of the things I think is always tricky with LDAP is often we'll refer to a directory, AD or otherwise, as an LDAP. The LDAP's also a protocol, right? There's a structure for how to query or write to a directory using the LDAP protocol. And one of the things I think is, depending on your perspective, LDAP is becoming less and less important. I think when I first got into identity management, over 15 years ago, it was one of the main disciplines of IAM. Like, if you didn't know LDAP, it's time to go hit the books and learn it. Nowadays, it just seems like cloud directories are kind of taking over, and with Active Directory, a lot of kind of core LDAP is not necessarily discipline that you need to have. So That's kind of maybe a controversial statement. I wonder if you agree with it.
So, at least my most recent experience, just because of where I work, Active Directory is a key technology that all of our customers have. So in my most recent experience, that hasn't been my experience, but it might just be because of the customer set that we have. You're right. There are additional directories, Google directories. There's other directories that you can use. But for me, AD, still is quite prevalent. I mean, what Fortune 500 company doesn't have an Active Directory? Is there any? I don't know.
I definitely agree with you from that standpoint. AD is definitely still has a foothold in the enterprise, especially when it comes to kind of network operating system. I'm just kind of wondering if the LDAP protocol, if we generically think of AD as an LDAP, I guess I'm with you 100%. But if I think of, learning LDAP as a protocol, it seems to me like there's not many people who manage Active Directory who have to run LDAP commands against the AD. But maybe I'm wrong.
No. I see what you're saying. So knowing LDAP and how to build LDAP queries and strings can definitely be helpful if you have really large implementation, if you've got thousands of OUs and tens of thousands of groups and so forth, for sure. So I see what you're saying. I do remember kind of back in the Windows NT, Windows 2000 days, learning the LDAP protocol was a big thing, but it's because it was new technology. It's like having to learn containers today or having to learn REST APIs and having to know how to do all the nitty gritty of those technologies because it's new. And as time goes on, you have utilities that get better to help you manage that. So I think today there's better Active Directory tools where you don't have to know everything about LDAP and how everything goes on the wire and the specific query you have to make.
Right, that's a great point as well. So Centrify is really known known for AD bridging technology. So what is AD? And you mentioned it, AD bridging. Describe AD bridging? What is that used for?
Certainly. So AD bridging is at its core using Microsoft's Active Directory implementation to provide privileged access to Linux machines. The traditional access, as you know, is single users and single password files and sudoers file. And so the AD bridging solution that Centrify or other vendors might provide provides you an ability to do privileged access management at the Active Directory user level. And so you can specify a user or security group that has access to a system or a set of systems or a computer or a set of computers and roles. And you can implement via AD bridging, RBAC. And so because everyone has a AD login, or at least we make the presumption that everyone has an AD login, we can tie that to implement privileged access management.
Yeah, and I think if you've got good identity governance and automation, your AD is probably connected to your HR system, so people are having access provision. Maybe they're getting some birthright access. Probably more importantly, when they separate from the organization, their account is being disabled or terminated somehow, maybe deleted. So if you have good practices around managing your access in AD, then you can leverage those when it comes to server management on the Linux side. Now, my experience has been that I run into a lot of resistance, and maybe that's softening some over the years, but I have run into a lot of Linux administrators where they don't want the management of their servers to be connected to AD. There's kind of a fear that, well, maybe, if I have to get in and fix something and this AD bridge doesn't work, then I'm up the creek without a paddle. So do you run into resistance much, and kind of what are your thoughts, and how do you handle that?
No, that's a good point. We certainly do have some resistance from some Linux admins at times. And one of the things that they mention, like you said, is if I implement this, it's going to break things, and then I'm not going to be able to do the work that I was able to do before, and it's going to make my job harder. Really the response there is that as your organization grows, your job is going to get harder. You're going to have to manage more sudoers file and more security administration at each server level, and it just becomes a lot harder. With AD bridging, you centralize that and you tie it in with your Active Directory. And an important thing to note too is that the AD bridging gets implemented, like we talked about a little bit earlier, as a pluggable authentication module, and it can work alongside your existing solution. So if you, as you transition from a traditional Unix management to a PAM solution using AD bridging, you might still have a few servers where you might still allow perhaps direct root access. But as you test out, you'll be able to move into a model where you can just use your Active Directory account, and you can just get single sign-on, where you don't have to manage the sudoers file as much, where you don't have to manage individual access to those servers. You manage it via the vendor, privilege access management tool. And so if we say that, if we can show that it's going to be actually easier in the long run, and that gains us some headway into that.
Yeah, my perspective is that you run into objections a lot of times. It's not just with the AD bridging. So I think the framework for how to address, sometimes these are fiefdoms, sometimes they're based on real legitimate concerns. But I think the first thing that you need to do is understand all the concerns, maybe start a document where you list out the concerns. Availability was one that I threw out there, if this isn't available, well, that could be true. It's true of single sign-on systems. A lot of times people say, well, if, single sign-on system is not available, none of our applications work. And so then what? We're up a creek without a paddle. So it's understanding all the objections and then being able to address them in a way that makes sense. And then sometimes I find that, if you can convince the party that, you've thought through all the objections and you've made a logical case on, how you go about solving them, and you still meet resistance, I think at that point it's, we're doing things for the business. We might need to escalate it to a higher level of management and make our case. But I think the best thing is to try to make a factual based case, because it's only going to sharpen your argument on why you need to move forward with the technology and why, the measures you're taking to make sure that this is the right decision for the organization, that you're meeting all these objectives or objections, I should say, are legitimate and well thought out, et cetera, et cetera. Because I think if we just kind of, if we just let people make objections and kind of stop us from moving forward on technology, we'd still be using mainframes everywhere. I mean, we've got to keep moving forward, and we take on objections and we come up with ways that we can make things work better. Anyway, so
I do actually add just
yes, please. No, please.
So I actually want to add a couple of things to that, because I'm actually thinking back specifically to a conversation that I had with one of our Linux customers. And so the particular solution or the explanation I gave to them is twofold. Is one, if you take a privilege access management solution that's been around for a while, that's solid, you want to look at that. So look at the track history of the particular company, and anything that's been around for a long time is just going to have higher reliability. Also, the solution should have, for example, what's called rescue rights, or the ability to log into the system if the authentication if the PAM module, the vendor's PAM module isn't working. So a good vendor solution is still going to provide that. Now, of course, you want to limit that to be a very small subset of users, but it still provides that fail-safe break glass mechanism. If you absolutely need to. So once I explained those two things to the particular customer and the particular Linux admin, he felt more at ease at that point.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very important, because a lot of times servers lose network connectivity. Let's just say that the network card went bad in the server and it can't reach the PAM server. How can you authenticate? Well, if there's a Firecall account that can be checked out, or what if the PAM system goes down? You have to kind of think through all these scenarios, and they're legitimate questions, right? They should be answerable. So I think there's a combination of thinking ahead and knowing what the objections are likely to be, but then also taking on the objections and being able, if you can't answer them in a logical way, you shouldn't get uptight or angry that people are asking the questions. You should be able to logically defend your position.
No, certainly. And what I try to do is I try to think to show how the solution can make the person's life easier, and how it can make management easier, management of accounts, management of access requests. I use the case, for example, when you have a new employee come in, they're going to send you an email to have access to all the web servers. You no longer have, if you're the Unix admin and you're managing 10 servers that are web servers, you have to give them access and make sure you do it right. But if you use a good solution, you just have to give it to one computer role and to one security group for the web admin servers, for example, and it's done, and it's instantaneously, and it takes 30 seconds or less for that all to be implemented. When Unix admins see that, they're like, whoa, this is cool. This makes my job so much easier. So if we can, what I know as I implement these solutions, like if I can show that it makes the person's life easier, then I get a lot better acceptance from the customer.
Right, absolutely. So let's call it good job on that game there. I did want to hit you with one more question before we wrap things up, and it's a big one. A lot of what we talked about today was server management, is kind of the traditional. It's been the same since we all had all of our data centers in-house, and most companies have either dipped their toe in or all in on infrastructure as a service using Azure or AWS or Google Cloud. So my question is, are these concepts still relevant? Are these things still important? Are we still doing privileged access management in the cloud, in cloud infrastructure?
That's a great question. So the answer really is yes, and more yes. And they become even more important because you're now responsible not just for your on-prem servers, but you're now responsible for Linux servers that are hosted somewhere else in the cloud. And so if you have a breach, or if you have an account or access that's compromised, that person now is using those AWS servers to spam or to launch attacks on other computers, and it looks like you're actually doing it. For example, in addition to extracting whatever valuable data exists on that. So everything in all the traditional problems with IAM and PAM come into play. And it becomes a little bit more complex because specifically you have to manage SSH keys, for example, and then all the other operating systems specifics that exist on-prem systems you also manage on cloud systems as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One of my points of view is that, you don't, by using a cloud service, you don't really give up the accountability. The buck still stops at your desk. If there is a breach, no one's going to care that you hired some third party and the third party fell apart and didn't do their job. It still comes back to you. And whether the infrastructure is in your data center or if it's in the cloud, ultimately it comes back to you and the reputation of your organization to protect your data. And so I still think privileged access management is as important as ever. And I think, when I think about privileged access management, my biggest concern is the inside threat. It's the administrator who knows 50 different passwords because they're in scripts, they're in service accounts. Maybe that person has accounts on individual instances of servers, or they have multiple Active Directory accounts. And how do you make sure that, all those things get turned off when the person leaves? And quite often it's not possible, right? Maybe 10 different people know a service account, or a lot of times you don't even know where the service account is being used across all the applications. So the real key is that the guidepost is humans don't need to know passwords, at least for privileged accounts. And so that's where I like to drive people to think about this.
So I don't necessarily disagree with that, but the way I think, at least personally for me, that I kind of try to sell it and sell myself really is, not accidental compromise, but just compromise because someone made an accidental mistake. They opened the wrong email. They they pressed on the wrong link. They went to a forum, and they had some sort of attack. They're using an old browser, whatever. Not even the insider threat, but if you're the domain admin or you're the CEO and you're targeted, or you're the CFO and you're targeted, and now your account's compromised and your data is exfiltrated, that's very different than the inside threat. Anybody can fall victim to something like that. So for me, at least, when I sell myself on my own personal security measures, and then when I travel and I think about personal security, or software security, I think the unintentional compromise and becoming a victim to sell me on the security solution or posture that I particularly take. Do you agree, or do you think that it's really the insider threat that people should be most worried about?
I think it's, I think it's all of the above. But I mean,
right.
You can't ignore phishing. I mean, it's probably the most obvious attack vectors to trick people into giving up their credentials. And then, for people to take that and then try to, there's different types of phishing. There's the concept of, phishing in general, but then there's spear phishing. So we know somebody is a powerful user and we're going to have a very targeted email at that individual. And, people make mistakes. I mean, I feel like I've kind of become an expert at spotting phishing attempts because they've gotten so good. They've gotten so good in so many cases where, you get the emails over and over again of your Apple ID, or, hey, we just approved your PayPal transaction or something like that. And you're just like, wait, I didn't spend $45 on PayPal to that vendor. I need to go check that out. And, really what they want you to do is just click on the link and put in your PayPal ID and then suck money out of your bank account.
Right. Or the CEO, you get a phishing email where the CEO says, I sent you a $50 Amazon gift card. Thanks for being a great employee. Click on this link. Oh, that's so cool. My CEO loves me. I'm going to go click on it. Right. Those sort of things are successful within organizations. And, that's not the inside threat. That's just somebody becoming a victim to an attack. And then because of the access that they have, or because the data that their user is privy to, now all of that gets compromised. And, you can do, potentially lateral movement if you have a high enough privileges and cause a lot more damage.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of different things. Paul, you're doing such a great job. I'd love to have you back, and we can dive into some more of these topics, things like, the phishing and where those conversations might lead us around multi-factor and things like that. But I'd say for today, we're kind of running out of time, but we would love to have you back and kind of explore some more of these topics. One thing I wanted to ask you, so if people want to reach out, get in contact with you, or, follow you on Twitter, or where are you active? Where can people get you on LinkedIn, or what do you have for that?
Sure. So if you want to talk tech, and feel free to just reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's Paul, Paul Volleson, Vollosen. I'm happy to connect and chat security. That's probably the best way. If you want to have a more personal connection, you can look me up on Facebook if you want. But then you're going to get some of my personal views. But if you just want to talk corporate stuff and security stuff, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Sounds fantastic, and we'll add that to the show notes, and we'll try to have Paul back before too long, and maybe hear more about some of these weekend adventures. I hope you can get into some weekend adventures outside by the time we have you back, and maybe we can hear about some of those.
It's been really hard, honestly, with lockdown. Everything is difficult to get out. So the good news is I've just been really productive. Bad news is I'm not really enjoying life, but hopefully that'll change. That'll change eventually. I mean, we'll get out of this eventually. And we're just kind of hunkering down like everyone else. But I'd love to be back, and I appreciate the conversation that we had today.
Yeah, I think you're making a great point. We're all in this together. It feels like we're moving toward hopefully the end of all this when we get back to normal life. And again, appreciate you joining this week, Paul, and hope to have you back again soon.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. For more episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.